Welcome to the first episode of the Paying Attention podcast. I'm Brent Beasley, lead the Fort Worth Education Partnership. And my guest today is my colleague, Leila Santillán. And I'll give you just a behind the scenes thing. Just before we started this, she said, if I could come up with my worst day at work, it would be this. Might want to cut that. Okay. Leila, the name of the podcast is Paying Attention. Can I ask you, just pop quiz, do you know what that means or where that's from?
You know, my best guess would be it's something about the importance of noticing or something within some, writing that you read or can quote.
Yeah, it's from a Mary Oliver poem, and the part of it that we're talking about says, instructions for living a life, pay attention, be astonished, tell about it. Mm-hmm. And so that's what we want this podcast to be about. We're going to pay attention, we're going to notice, we're going to be present, and then we're going to be astonished. You know, the world is full of wonder and the people in it are full of wonder, and we want to talk to interesting, wonderful people, and then we want to tell about it. We want to talk about it, share, express ourselves. So that's what we're going to do. Pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. And Leila is my colleague from Fort Worth Education Partnership. She's the first person that I hired back in 2020. We did our interviews in person right before the pandemic, and then the pandemic hit. And so when you started work, we were virtual and didn't meet in person for many months, I think.
I think it might have been a year and a half or so.
That's crazy.
Maybe in a parking lot or something.
That's crazy. Yeah. So Leila's the one who helped get us organized at the beginning, took the idea into the reality of an organization with bank accounts and all those kinds of things. Yeah, so I want to talk about the new report that we've just finished creating and we're putting out. So the first report, the one that we've been doing for a few years, is the City Academic Performance Report, which shows this most recent one that 37% of kids who go to school in the city of Fort Worth are meeting grade level standards on the state test. Mm-hmm. And I think what we have often talked about and thought about is it's not just the test per se that we're interested in. What we're interested in is the life of these kids. We're interested in the outcomes, and it's about their opportunities. And so that's what led us to this new report. Mm-hmm. And so talk about this new report, which is entitled High School and Beyond. What is this? Yeah. What, at a very high level, like what is this about?
And I think you hit, a really important piece of this, which is, looking at our kind of other report. We've been thinking about what is the long-term impact of that, and that's what really this entire report is about. This is our first time doing an analysis of long-term life outcomes, and I say life outcomes because I think we can pretty clearly see that when we look at the level of students attaining an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree, those things are linked directly towards the likelihood of earning a living wage, which is incredibly impactful for a student's or a young person, adults into their adulthood life outcome. And so this report specifically looks at data from the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. They essentially track students over an 11-year period starting in 8th grade. And so they look at 8th graders, they track them through high school completion, and then beyond to see how many students are pursuing higher education, how many students are pursuing 2-year degrees, 4-year degrees, and ultimately how many students are attaining those degrees. And they also look at credential certificates as well. Yeah. And so that's really kind of the essence of this report, is understanding how kids that are in 8th grade and middle schools in Fort Worth, what are the long-term outcomes that we see for those kids. And it's important because there's such, as I said, a direct connection to their living wage attainment. We know that if a student doesn't have a 2 or 4 year degree, there's only a 12% chance of them getting attaining a living wage in their lifetime. And so, that's kind of what we're talking about when we talk about the impact of this report.
And, just tying all that together. So the first report, which is about how younger kids are doing in school, we know there are studies that have followed third grade kids over time. And it shows that if you're a third grader and you're testing at the below grade level, you're not meeting grade level in the state test, your chance of getting a 2 or 4 year degree is really slim. Like it's less than 2%. And so we know we can make that connection. And now I feel like what you're kind of now connecting is, and if you don't get that 2 or 4 year degree, here's your chances of earning a living wage, which is only about a 12% chance. So it's sort of tying all of this together across this spectrum of years. Yeah. So let's look at the report a little bit as far as the city of Fort Worth. Well, first of all, what are the sort of big picture headlines that we found when we looked at this data?
Yeah, we talk about why it's important, but what did it actually look like when we looked at the city of Fort Worth? So I think, there's 4 kind of main headlines of this report. I think number 1, a significant share of our students are not finishing high school. I think that was something, we talked about how shocking that was. When we looked at the group of 8th graders that were, in 8th grade in 2011, 2012, or 2013, only 78% of those 8th graders went on to graduate from high school, from a Texas high school. And so, I think that was shocking to think about. We're essentially right there off the bat losing about 1 in every 5 kids that is in a public 8th grade class in Fort Worth. So I think that's number 1. Number 2, most of our high school graduates, so the students that kind of make it through that trajectory, end up graduating high school, aspire to attend higher education. I think, sometimes that runs contrary to what people think, but when we looked at the data in Fort Worth, 58% of our Fort Worth middle schoolers who graduated from a Texas public high school went on to enroll in a Texas higher education institution.
So well over half of these kids are actually starting community college or 4-year college.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. And so our students understand and can appreciate the impact of higher education, the ways in which that can be aligned to what they want to be true for their long-term kind of life outcomes. So that was number 2. I think number 3, kind of when we looked at how or where kids decide to go to school, overwhelmingly the majority of kids in Fort Worth are starting with a 2-year college. And so we saw that 27% of the original 8th grade cohorts we looked at were interested in attending a 2-year school, about 10% more than those that pursued a 4-year school. And so, community colleges, 2-year colleges are kind of a first stop for many Fort Worth students. And then I think the last thing I'd say is just that, when you zoom out to see the entire picture, kind of too few students are actually achieving those higher education aspirations. And so kind of the headline there is we only saw about 14% of students end up with a bachelor's degree and 5% an associate's degree of those that kind of pursued higher education and were interested in that pathway to begin with. And so, that means kind of if we zoom out, fewer than 1 in 5 who attended a Fort Worth middle school end up securing a degree from a Texas institution within 6 years of their graduation. And so we just talked about the importance of that for their life outcome, and we're falling pretty short.
Yeah. So let's look at the report and let's look at the city of Fort Worth and follow these 8th graders along this journey that we've been talking about here. Because what it's like, it kind of reminds me as we talk about it, it's like a wave or maybe a river that starts really big at the beginning where there's all these 8th graders. There's how many over this period?
29,000.
Yeah, so almost 30,000 8th graders that we're starting with in the city of Fort Worth. And then as we move through the different, stops along the way, high school, college, graduation, all these things, this river just gets narrow and narrow and narrow. And so you end up with this, it's sort of a trickle at the end. So let's kind of talk through that. So we start with these 29,000 8th graders over a couple of year period, 3-year period. And then how does it kind of walk us through kind of what happens to those kids as they go?
Yeah, great question. So, as you said, we start kind of with a group of 30,000 across 3 8th grade years, basically, at the beginning. And when we look kind of long term, we talked about already there, there's significant drop off through high school. And so you can find in the report kind of broken down both at the city level and individual council districts, just that drop off that happens each year. By the time we get to 10th grade, we're only at 81%, 24,000 of that original, that are on track kind of in the 10th grade. And so you see that each year as you go through just the high school years. When we look at the next stop in that journey of high school graduation, that has shrunk down to 78% of the original cohort.
Yeah, so each year from 8th grade, we're losing kids from the system each year progressively until then it comes to graduation, and we're losing quite a bit, aren't making it to that.
Yeah, that's right. And one kind of aside that I think is interesting is when we look at a lot of kind of living wage attainment data, it compares high school graduates that have a high school diploma against 2-year and 4-year degrees. There's a whole group of kids that have been lost before that don't even have that kind of first step, which is their kind of graduation from high school. And so looking at those 8th graders after high school graduation, we're down to 78%, 23,000 of those 8th graders. And then, 9% of those students, about 2,600, go on to study or pursue higher education outside of the state of Texas. And so, we know there's a small subset of students that do that. The data doesn't track kind of the outcomes of those in a deep way. It focuses on what are the outcomes of those that are in Texas. And so, at that point, we have another drop off of 24% that don't go on to enroll in higher education.
Yeah. So we're losing like 22% who don't graduate high school, and then there's another 24% who are graduating, but then they're not going anywhere else for further education after that. So right there, we're at 46% of those 8th graders are not doing anything beyond high school.
Yeah, that's right. And so when we look at those original 8th graders, 45% of those go on to enroll in Texas higher education. As I shared, for the majority of those students, the first stop is enrolling in a 2-year college. And so for our 8th grade Fort Worth specific cohort, 8,000 went on to enroll in a 2-year college, about 27% of the original cohort size. And another 5,400 went on to enroll in a 4-year college, about 18% of the original group of 30,000.
Okay.
And so then we follow those kind of the next stop along the journey. They wanted to pursue higher education. They attended a 2-year or 4-year program. What kind of happens next? We see essentially 5% earning an associate's degree from there. So they have the original group of 30,000, 5% earn an associate's degree, just over 1,000 of the kind of 8,000 that pursued.
Started there.
Yes. And there's a small movement of some students that started at a 4-year that ended up, going to get their associate's degree. For the city of Fort Worth, that was only about 200 kids, a pretty small subset. And then when we look at the bachelor's degree, we had about 4,200 of those original group of 8th graders, just 14% that ended up earning a bachelor's degree from a Texas institution. And so kind of when we zoom out across the city, we see about 19% that got an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree that pursued higher education in Texas.
19%. Yeah. What's so great about this report, I think, and what we're doing with this is it's really exactly what we're talking about the title of this podcast, which we're paying attention to what's happening here with our kids, because it's really kind of hidden from our eyes. So we're paying attention. We are astonished, honestly, by what we see. When I first looked at these numbers, I was astonished that we're losing 22% of Fort Worth kids before they even finish high school. These 8th graders, and then we're telling about it. We're putting it out there. We're showing people, and we're talking about it. And so I think there's such power in that, and that's what we're trying to do here. To learn more about Fort Worth Education Partnership, check out our website, fortworthep.org. And we are on Instagram at FortWorthEP. We've looked at this, we're talking about citywide, but we've also broken it down in the report by different parts of the city, so by council district. And so there's a whole page here in the report about council district by council district, how are these same numbers in that? And so can you just give us a sense of some of the variation in some of the council districts that we see? Because the overall number is 19% of Fort Worth kids, these 8th graders, are getting a 2 or 4 year degree, but that varies a lot by what part of the city they live in.
Yeah, it does, and we can talk about some of those examples. And I think the other thing, though, I would also say is there's no council district where 100% of kids or 80 or even 90%, 80, are kind of reaching these outcomes. And so while there is great variation, for example, City Council District 5, we saw 3% of students earning an associate's degree. 3%. And 6% earning a bachelor's degree. And so, when we think about that kind of...
Less than 10% of the kids in that part of our city are earning a 2 or 4 year degree.
Yeah, absolutely. On the kind of upper end that we see in the city, in City Council District 4, which is kind of north part of the city, we see 23% earning a bachelor's degree from Texas institution and 6% earning an associate's degree. And so even on the upper end, that we're still kind of under 30% there. You might ask yourself, well, are there a ton of kids going out of state? Even in that council district, we're still at only 10% going out of state. So we're still under 50%, and you've made the point when we talk about our city academic report, there's no council district where more than 50% of kids are meeting grade level. And so it's interesting to think about it's interesting, at the same time, troubling to think about the fact that, nowhere are we seeing, more than 50% of kids that are reaching these really important long-term educational milestones for their life outcomes.
Yeah, there's no part of our city, even the part that we would think of as the most affluent, where more than 50% of the kids are meeting grade level standards when they're younger. And there's no part of our city where more than 50% of the kids are earning a post-secondary, a 2 or 4 year degree. Yeah, it's really interesting. I wanted to talk a little bit about the high schools. We decided, we talked about this a lot and decided we wanted to show how the kids are doing in each of the different high schools in Tarrant County. And so we have a whole section here at the end of the report that shows every high school in Tarrant County, and it follows the kids who graduate from that high school through this same trajectory. So how many kids are enrolling in college, how many are getting a degree, and all of that. So can you kind of walk us through what that looks like? Maybe give us a couple of example high schools, if you want to point to.
Yeah, absolutely. So, to talk about the kind of the high school data. So we're looking here at 8th graders that went on to graduate from Pascal as one example, kind of high school we can dive into. There were 444 high school graduates when we looked. We were looking at a singular cohort year here. So 444 high school graduates. When we looked at, how many of those went on to enroll in a Texas higher education institution, it was 64%. So about 2/3 of students that pursued Texas higher education, another 13% enrolled out of state. And so, together we see nearly 80% kind of pursuing some sort of post-secondary, educational options. Majority of students that stayed in Texas institutions, 36% enrolled in a Texas 2-year college, and 28% enrolled in a 4-year school. When we get to that kind of ultimate outcome, what percentage of students are earning associate's degrees or earning bachelor's degrees? For Pascal, we saw 5% earn an associate's degree and 26% earn a bachelor's degree. And so, again, we're still, if you think about a combined, 30% or so that are getting some sort of degree.
I feel like you're targeting me a little by picking the high school in my neighborhood where my kids went. You're trying to make a point, but the point really is this is one of the Fort Worth high schools that we think of as one of our best. Most people do, and so these are the numbers of kind of at our best in the city of Fort Worth. At least the way we think of it.
And to share maybe one more example, walking through just kind of, I have these alphabetical on here. If you think of Polytechnic High School, they had 250.
Polytechnic is on Rosedale, east side of I-35.
250 high school graduates. 47% went on to enroll in Texas higher education, 6% enrolled out of state. When we look at the outcomes of the folks who pursued higher education in Texas, 29% started by pursuing a 2-year, attending a 2-year college, enrolling in a 2-year college, and another 18% started by enrolling in a 4-year college. Again, zooming out, what are the outcomes of those pathways? 2% went on to earn an associate's degree from a Texas institution, and 8% earning a bachelor's degree, 8% earning a bachelor's degree from a Texas institution. And so, combined 10% essentially of kind of that group of graduates that we looked at.
That big river that starts there really turns into just a tiny trickle by the end. So when we look at these kind of outcomes, these life outcomes that we're talking about in this report, which essentially is 19% of Fort Worth kids who start in 8th grade are ending up with some kind of degree after high school. What do you make of that? Like, what's behind that? What do we have to say about that kind of reality?
Yeah, I think one, and we kind of touched on this already, I'll say that we see the early signs of this. We're talking about the kind of end of that, but we see some of that all the way through all of these other pieces of data that we look at. And I think secondly, I would say just too many students lack the foundation to reach kind of these milestones that are tied to positive life outcomes, right? Students are pursuing, are interested, want to attain a degree. They understand the correlation of those things with positive life outcomes, specifically kind of access to a living wage. And so there are a number of reasons why, they're not kind of reaching that goal that they have for their future. And I'm not sure how we can be okay with that as a community. We have to find a way to build a different future for our kids.
When you know that 37% of kids are meeting grade level when they're younger, it's actually not that shocking to find out that most of our kids are not being able to be successful in college as well.
To do a deep dive on the Fort Worth Education Partnership Report, High School and Beyond, tracking the life outcomes of Fort Worth students, it's on our website, fortworthep.org/reports.
When you started working with us, we didn't know what we were going to be doing exactly, but you have become the person behind the data and all of the reports that we do. And, I remember when we got started on down this path of the reports, Pete Guerin of the Sid Richardson Foundation and I were meeting with a Fort Worth City Council member, and we thought to ourselves, wouldn't it be interesting if we could show her how the kids that live in her council district are doing, and, educationally. And we didn't realize there wasn't really a place to look that up because, she had multiple ISD, school districts, schools, and there were charter schools and all, what the data wasn't broken down like that. So we called you and said, can you figure out how to do for this council district, take all the kids who go to school there, what percentage of those kids are meeting grade level? That was the idea. So you did that for her. We showed it to her at lunch, and it had she had a big reaction because it was like 14% or something like that. It was really low.
Yeah.
And so then we said, we're onto something. We need to do this for the whole city. And so we asked you to do that. So you just figured out how to do that. You got out the maps, and you did all the stuff, and you've really become an expert on education data in Fort Worth and really beyond. And what has that been like? You didn't set out to become a education data expert, but somehow you have become that.
I never knew some of the things that I would know now related to education data, and I have a really interesting relationship with the word expert. So, as a person who appreciates learning, I don't think that, expertise is ever something that you feel you're kind of there at. But I will say I'm probably one of a handful of folks who, reads the accountability manual every year, cover to cover. So I appreciate that. But, I'll say a couple of things about this. I think first, and I think this is really important, is just, I look at data probably every day, a different version of some set of data or cut of the data, and particularly about how kids in Fort Worth or Tarrant County or Texas are doing. I think it's really important to me that we never lose sight of what is behind that data, right? When we talk about data, we're talking about each individual child. And I think that's important for a couple of reasons. I think one, as a mom who has 3 kids in our public school system, I know and appreciate that like every kid that we're talking about is somebody's whole world that they're sending off to school every day, with their hopes and dreams in that child's pocket of what they want that child's future to look like. I feel that for my own kids as a mom, and so I think it's important that we acknowledge and remember that. And then I think the other thing that I'll say about the importance of remembering the individual kids behind data, I think sometimes, and I can fall into this at times as well, when we look at the scale of the issue that we're facing, right, where we're at as a city, where we need to be, where we want to be to use your words to ensure that we're aligned with what our belief about what it should be is, we're talking about tens of thousands of kids in aggregate that are not where they need to be on that path for the future. And so I think it's important that we remember that it's individual kids, because then we can start to think about scoping an understanding of approaching that challenge, right? We can start to think about, okay, we're talking about one city here, and we're talking about one school district, and now we're down to a school, and now we're down to a classroom, and now we're down to a kid, and we can start to generate ideas that maybe we otherwise wouldn't have thought about ways that we can be supportive. And I think we're seeing a ton of examples now in the city of folks who are doing that, right? I think examples like the North Texas Community Foundation, and the city coming together to support one specific school, and thinking about how to support those students at Clifford Davis Elementary, or the city of Fort Worth working on literacy roundup, to do city level testing for dyslexia. Those are the sorts of things that we can do when we start to remember we can tackle this one kid at a time, one family at a time. If I think about the work that the Go Beyond Grades campaign is doing with nonprofit partners to inform families. And so I think that kind of orientation is really important. And then the second kind of big picture thing that I'll say is just, talking about this kind of data can be really challenging, right? Words like accountability, outcomes, performance, those sorts of things aren't words that, evoke positive emotion in any of us. And so I think that that can be challenging at times.
It sometimes feels like we're always the bearer of bad news.
Yes.
When we talk about these things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember, you were talking about the release of our first report. I remember some of the dialogue around the release of that first report. There were a lot of folks who didn't question certain things that were in there to say, should we really be talking about how kids are doing? Should we really be talking about kids meeting grade level? And I think, we're 5 years on the other side of that, and we're starting to see an understanding and, the effects of being willing to talk about what is really uncomfortable and the change that can come when we do that. And so I just think in this, leading in this work, it's important to be willing to do things that sometimes are, unpopular on the outset, or, run contrary to kind of the general conversation, but that we, feel and know and see in the data and findings that, these things have impacts for kids on their life.
Yeah. I think when you say it's not acceptable, I mean, I agree with you. I think this is what this is all about, this paying attention and being astonished and then telling about it is really about this idea that we've got to be able to understand and face the reality of how our kids in Fort Worth are doing. And then we also, as a community, we have values about what we all agree that every child should have access to all the opportunities they would ever want in their life. And so when we see when we have that value and then we see how they're actually doing, that is astonishing. We are astonished by this, not in a good way. It's heartbreaking. And we tell about it. And what we're hoping comes from that is it starts conversations. It pushes people into action. It lights a fire under people. We don't have all the answers for what should be done, but we hope that by paying attention and telling about it, that astonishment that people feel when they learn about it will lead to something. And there's the way things are, and there's the way things ought to be, and when there's a big gap between those two things, it makes people want to do something about it. And so that's what we're all about, is like encouraging our community to do something about it. And I think that's what this podcast is going to be about. We're going to have people on here who are doing something about it. And that's what we want to talk about over these next episodes.
And I think to use a word that I've heard you use before, to do that, right, to pay attention and to be astonished and to tell about it, is really about an act of love towards a different future that we know is possible for kids, in the same way, you know, that my 5th grade teacher kind of did things out of an act of love, you know, for a belief that it can be different one day.
Yeah, if we love the kids of Fort Worth, we want the best for them. And it's heartbreaking to us to see that they may not have the opportunities that we want them to have and that they want. Thank you, Leila, for doing this. These are complicated numbers. Thank you for walking through it with us and helping us understand it. And we thank you for all you do for Fort Worth Education Partnership and for Fort Worth.
Yeah, absolutely. Great to be here. Thank you.
This is a Fort Worth Education Partnership production. To watch Paying Attention, subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also listen to Paying Attention wherever you get your podcasts.